Good morning, everybody, and thank you again for joining us for this webinar. My name is Simon Steenson, and I'm a nutrition scientist at the British Nutrition Foundation. And I'm going to talk a bit more about what do we mean when we talk around a healthier and more sustainable diet, and some of the findings from a review that we recently undertook in this area to try and get a handle on what are the main features of a healthier and more sustainable diet, and also some practical advice on how we can try to do this. And so you're probably already aware, but there is, of course, an urgent need to change our food systems in terms of both how we produce as well as consume foods. And you can see here in the quote that whilst food systems have the potential to nurture human health and support environmental sustainability, they're currently threatening both. And that includes on the people perspective. For example, 1 in 5 deaths globally are associated with a poor diet. We have issues with overweight and obesity, but also underweight. And in the UK, over 2/3 of men and 6 out of 10 women in England are living with overweight or obesity. But at the same time, world hunger increased recently between 2019 to 2020, and largely as a result of the pandemic. But on the planet side of things, we know that food production is the largest contributor to global environmental change. And up to 1/3 of greenhouse gases from human activity are linked to food production. The vast majority of freshwater withdrawals globally, as well as a sizable proportion of land use. Coupled with that, of course, we have a growing population that's set to reach close to 10 billion people by the middle part of this century. And with that is an expected increasing demand for about 50% increase in demand for food. And that includes particularly an increased demand for animal-based foods as people in developing nations become more prosperous and incomes rise. And in a global context, the United Nations Sustainable Development Goals, nutrition and food security are considered to be pivotal to achieving all of these 17 goals. But this collection of issues that we have really raises the question of how we can continue to feed a growing population while reducing malnutrition and also the environmental effects of our current food system. And so I think it's useful to talk a little bit more first about what do we mean by a healthier and more sustainable diet. So you can see here in the box a definition from almost a decade ago now from the United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization, or FAO. And you can see in bold that there are a number of different aspects that are highlighted within this kind of all-encompassing definition of a sustainable diet. It's about being acceptable, accessible, nutritionally adequate, fair and affordable. About protecting biodiversity, natural and human resources. And so it really does encompass a lot of different factors. So that leads us on though really to, while this is useful as a starting point, how can we really put this into practice? And there is still a lot of debate, of course, around what exactly a healthy and more sustainable diet should and should not contain. And one area within this that's received a lot of attention is around the role of animal-derived foods, including meat and dairy. Now, they have attracted a lot of attention, of course, because of the contribution that they make to the environmental impact of our food system globally. So if livestock, for example, accounts for about almost 15% of greenhouse gases, both direct and indirect. So direct from methane from cattle, for example, as well as indirect emissions from things like transport or processing. And this is mainly due to the production of animal feed and also methane from cattle. And alongside this, we also have an increasing public interest in eating a more plant-based diet. What exactly we mean by that, we'll talk a little bit more about in a moment. However, it is important to make several points really against this, which is firstly that the environmental impact of animal-based foods, as well as other foods that we eat in our diet, does largely depend on where and how they are produced. And there's a need to consider also the nutritional contribution of products, meat and dairy and other animal-based foods within our diet, and also to think about diets that are affordable and acceptable. If we think about nutrition, then restricting or eliminating animal-based foods from the diet potentially can make it more difficult to get adequate amounts of certain nutrients, particularly if we're not eating a very diverse diet. So you can see here in the table the contribution that is made to intakes of a number of key nutrients like iron, vitamin D, zinc, and iodine that comes from animal-based foods in the UK diet at the moment. And you can see that it's quite a significant proportion for many of these. But also, if we are shifting the source of these nutrients from animal to plant-based foods, then there are some other things we need to consider, such as the bioavailability of things like iron. So how well the nutrient is absorbed by the body and utilized by the body. So heme iron, for example, from animal-based foods is more available than iron from plant-based sources. Vitamin D3, which is the type we tend to get in supplements, is more effective, it seems, at raising our vitamin D levels in the blood than vitamin D2 supplements that are from plant-based sources. And also minerals like calcium, iron, and zinc. There are compounds in plant-based foods, such as oxalic acid or phytic acid, that can bind to these minerals and prevent them from being absorbed or make it more difficult for them to be absorbed by the body. And lastly, I'd just like to mention iodine, which is perhaps something that not many people would consider and when shifting to a more plant-based diet. But about a third of the iodine in our diets at the moment is from milk and dairy products in the UK. And some milk alternatives are not always fortified with this. Environmental point of view, it's important to acknowledge as well also that all of the foods in our diet, that there can be potentially a huge variation in their impacts, both between producers as well as different products globally. For example, in a large-scale study looking at almost 40,000 different farms across the globe, they found that when they compared the top 10% of most impactful beef producers with the 10% of least impactful producers, that they had about 12 times greater greenhouse gas emissions and about 50 times greater land use. And if we bring it into the UK situation, then emissions from agriculture are about 10% of our total territorial greenhouse gas emissions, which is, as you can see on the right, lower than for some other areas of our economy. And when we think about livestock in the UK, about 6% of our emissions come from livestock, which is lower than an average for the EU. And this has generally decreased in the UK over the last 30 years or so. And so the point here is that it's important that we distinguish between locally relevant and global average figures when we talk about environmental impact, so that it really does represent true impact of how a food has been produced. And I mentioned before the term plant-based, which I'm sure you've no doubt heard, but I think there is a lot of confusion around what this perhaps means. So you can see here the results of a BNF survey that we conducted about a year ago of over 2,000 adults in the UK. And greater than 6 out of 10 believed that a plant-based diet meant either vegetarian or a vegan diet. And about 41% thought that this meant a vegan diet. And so we can see that there's a appears to be a clear confusion that a plant-based diet means one which restricts or entirely excludes animal-based foods, as opposed to one that is mainly composed of plant-based foods, such as the Eat Well guide, which we'll look at later. And so hopefully that gives a good introduction to some of the issues around how we define a healthier and more sustainable diet, and some of the issues that need to be considered. And so we, in light of a lot of these issues, we did a review at the British Nutrition Foundation to look at what the recent scientific evidence suggests are the main features of a healthier and more sustainable diet. So that included 29 studies from high-income countries like the UK that were all done within the last 10 years. Now, two important things are that we firstly looked at whole diets and not just studies that suggested changing specific food groups, and also those that included at least one measure of environmental impact alongside a measure of the quality of the diet or the nutrient content of the diet. And we also included studies from that had a range of different approaches to how they defined a healthier and more sustainable diet to try to get an idea of what the synergies, differences, and trade-offs are. And so overall, across all of the different studies that we looked at, the evidence was generally quite consistent to suggest that diets that have more of the plant-derived foods that you see, things like vegetables, fruits, whole grains, beans and pulses, nuts, seeds, and also plant-based meat alternatives, that these are likely to increase. This is likely to decrease greenhouse gas emissions and land use of our diets, but also to have health benefits. However, the dietary patterns that were healthier and more sustainable in the studies we looked at did also include some more moderate meat consumption, and this still had an important role in the diets. For example, in providing essential nutrients such as iron. When it came to dairy foods and eggs, the findings as to whether these increased or decreased in the diet was actually more mixed. It was less consistent. And this might be because that these foods have a high nutrient contribution in the diet relative to their environmental impact. And so this comes on to one of the areas that I mentioned before, which is that of trade-offs. So when we consider, for example, the environment alongside health and cost and other factors, there are often different factors that need to be traded off against each other. And lastly, foods that are high in fat, salt, and/or sugar, and also beverages, alcoholic and non, made a substantial contribution to the current diet in some countries, for example, in the Netherlands and Australia. But this is quite important because these are not included in many studies of more sustainable diets. And yet, if these are consumed often or in large amounts, they can make quite a significant contribution to the impact of our diet. In terms of the size of environmental benefit that could be achieved, we found that across all of the different studies and approaches, somewhere in the approximate region of about 20 to 50% lower greenhouse gases and land use appeared to be achievable while respecting all of these different domains. So nutrition and health, but also what's affordable and what's culturally acceptable. However, it is worth highlighting that there are, again, trade-offs that have to be considered. For example, water footprint might be more difficult to achieve a reduction in through making dietary changes alone. That could be, for example, maybe due to the higher fruit and vegetable or nut intake that's required to meet recommendations. Nuts, for example, in particular, are a very water-intensive crop. And so I'd like to zoom in a little bit more on a particular aspect of the review that we did, which was to look at what's called optimization studies. So optimization is a technique that allows us to identify theoretical diets that meet not just nutrition recommendations, but also reduce environmental impact, as well as minimizing the changes that are required to the current diet. So we looked across 52 different scenarios, and the general changes that were suggested were that overall, in the majority of scenarios, fruit and vegetables and other plant-based foods that you see here, as well as also fish and seafood, tended to increase, whereas meat and beverages and high fat, salt, sugar foods tended to decrease. And again, similar to what we saw before on the previous slide, the changes were less consistent for milk and yogurts and eggs, and also oils and spreads. And so that brings us on to the question of what about a vegetarian or a vegan diet? We found from the studies that we looked at that, yes, while they could deliver quite a large reduction in greenhouse gases, up to 83% in one study, for example, as well as less land use and potentially have health benefits, there are some other things that we need to think about. They could, for example, potentially slightly increase water footprint compared to the current diet that we eat. And it might also be unachievable for many people. So at the moment, only about 4% of people in the UK are vegetarian and about 1% are vegan, according to official figures that we have. And while, of course, there is a huge increase in interest in more vegetarian or plant-based diets and and in consuming more plant-based foods in our diet and perhaps reducing meat intake, it appears at the moment that only a very small proportion of people are actually following this in their diet. So also we need to consider whether or not this would reduce intakes or the bioavailability of some important nutrients, things like iron, zinc, iodine, vitamin A, and B12. And this could be a potential cause for concern for some groups where we already have evidence of low nutrient intakes or status. So, for example, 1 in 10 girls in the UK aged 11 to 18 are thought to have iron deficiency and anemia. And so that brings me on to the sort of the next and final part, really, which is to look at, based on these findings and this evidence, how can we actually try to eat a healthier and more sustainable diet? And I think the first point to really make is that there's no one size fits all solution to such a complex problem. We are all different. We, in terms of our age, our personal preferences, cultural preferences, and so it is a difficult thing to make some any absolute suggestions. But there are some general actions that we can all take that are likely to benefit both our health and that of the planet. And these are across 6 different areas, which we'll look at in some more detail. Firstly, following more closely the Eat Well guide to eat a more plant-rich diet with more fiber, but the one that also allows for moderate amounts of animal-based foods. So this would likely have environmental as well as health benefits. So you can see in green there the findings from a study from last year, which found that following the Eat Well guide more closely would lead to almost a third lower greenhouse gas emissions, slightly lower water use, and lower mortality risk as well. Another thing to consider, I think, is that the Eat Well guide is an eating pattern that is familiar to us in the UK, and as I mentioned, allows for some nutrient-rich animal-derived foods in moderation. At the moment, in the study that I mentioned on the previous slide, about 30% of adults and children are achieving at least 5 out of 9 recommendations, showing that there is room for improvement. And only about 0.1% manage to achieve all 9 recommendations. So there's definitely a need for us to shift in this direction. And that includes, for example, eating more fruit, vegetables, whole grains, and higher fiber, starchy foods, beans and other pulses as well. And this would increase fiber intakes, which is an important area, as we know that in the UK, fewer than 1 in 5 children and 1 in 10 adolescents and adults actually meet their age-specific fiber recommendations at the moment. The second area is around eating more fruit and vegetables, something that we all know that we should do more of, perhaps, but is not always easy. And we know that fruit and veg are a good source of essential vitamins, minerals, and fiber, and we should aim for at least 5 portions a day to reduce the risk of a number of conditions such as heart disease, stroke, and some cancers. And within this, variety is very important. So trying to get a variety of different colors and types of fruit and vegetables in our diet, because they all provide different essential nutrients. But at the moment, only about a third of UK adults and fewer than 1 in 8 adolescents are actually getting the 5 a day. And so on this slide here and over the next few, I've just got a few examples of some practical suggestions for how we could try to do this. Things like swapping snacks, some things like a bag of crisps for a banana, or trying to find ways to get more fresh, frozen, or canned vegetables into recipes. Also, adding fruit to breakfast cereals or porridge is another way that we can try to work this into our routine. And again, these are just suggestions, and these may work better or less well for some people, but these are ways that we can try to put this advice into action. And the third area is to try to expand the range of protein providing foods that we have in our diet, and also to shift the balance more to include more plant-based sources. So to rebalance in favor of things like more beans and pulses, nuts, seeds, and maybe also some plant-based meat alternatives, alongside some meat, fish, and dairy products and eggs. Important to remember that it's not just about protein. There's a need to think about the overall nutrient composition of plant-based alternatives that we have. So including essential nutrients, things that are typically provided by animal-based foods like iron, zinc, calcium, iodine. And a couple of ways in which we can try to rebalance the protein intake in our diet in this way is, for example, adding canned beans to a dish like chili or curry, or chickpeas to a salad, for example, or also having a small handful of nuts or seeds as a snack. The fourth area is to try to find ways to limit the foods in our diet that we know are less healthy, things like cakes, biscuits, pies, pastries, because while they're not the healthiest choice, which we all know, they can also contribute, as we saw before, to the greenhouse gases, the land, and the water use that is linked to our diets. And so a couple of ways we can do this is, well, to try to be more aware of the portion sizes that we have. So placing a small amount of crisps in a bowl, for example, or buying smaller multi-packs rather than larger bags. And also trying to plan ahead to have healthier snack options available. So things like lower sugar whole wheat cereal with milk, or wholemeal toast and peanut butter, or fat-free no added sugar yogurt and berries. So things that we can have to try to provide us with a healthier option when we want it. And the fifth one is around fish and seafood. So we know that it is important to have at least 2 portions of fish a week, at least one of which should be an oily fish like mackerel, sardines, or salmon, because fish not only contain protein, but also vitamins and minerals and things like long chain omega-3 fats that can benefit heart health. However, about a third of global fish stocks at the moment are overfished. And so it's important that we try to find ways to eat more sustainable sources of fish and seafood, and to find out more information about where it comes from. So one thing we can do is to experiment with a wider variety outside of the big 5. So these are these species that we tend to eat most often. They make up about 80% of the fish and seafood that we eat in the UK: cod, haddock, tuna, salmon, and prawns. And so one way we can try to move away from this is, for example, to use the Good Fish Guide from the Marine Conservation Society, which provides more sustainable alternatives. And it's not just about the type of fish, but also how it's caught as well. So you can see in the example here that cod from Iceland is more sustainable due to the better levels of the stocks naturally than cod from the UK waters. But an alternative is to switch to something like European hake. And also on the left, you can see examples of some eco labels which set standards for the environmental performance, but also things such as welfare and also employment conditions as well. And while these standards do vary, this is one thing we can do to try to buy products that have been produced to more sustainable standards. And you can see things such as the blue MSC logo on the left, which is probably the most recognizable one, but there are others available as well. And so the last area that I'd just like to touch on, I think is very important, is that we waste less food and drinks. In this, irrespective of the type of diet that we consume, it's important that we waste less of what we buy and what is available to us. The FAO estimates that about a third of food that is lost in the supply chain or wasted globally, and about 10% of greenhouse gas emissions totally, the total global, greenhouse gas emissions are linked to food waste. And in the UK, we've made good progress, as you can see on the right, in recent years in reducing food waste. But in spite of this, less than a third of UK adults actually make a clear link between food waste and climate change. And so increasing awareness and finding ways to reduce food waste is important. WRAP, or the Waste and Resources Action Programme, had their first Food Waste Action Week this year, in which they highlighted this link between wasting food and climate change. And one of the things that we can do is, number one, to try to use the information on food labels better. So best before or use by dates, for example, information on how to store foods, as well as planning meals before going shopping. We should try to avoid buying more than we need, or only getting the things that we want for the meals that we've planned. And then also even simple things like setting our fridge to the correct temperature. In the UK, it tends to be above this 0 to 5 degrees range, about 7 degrees. And that means we're more likely to waste foods. For example, 3 million glasses of milk are poured down the sink every day in the UK. And so that brings me to the end, just to wrap up and to sort of reiterate some of the main messages, hopefully, and takeaways that are that healthier, more sustainable diets need to consider a range of factors. So not just environmental impact and nutrition, but also health, cost, and acceptability, among others, such as the livelihoods of producers working in the food system. More sustainable dietary patterns do tend to contain more plant-based foods, but can also include moderate amounts of meat, milk, fish, and eggs, and they make an important nutritional contribution. And this is what may potentially suffer as a result of vegetarian and vegan diets. While they may have large environmental benefits, it's possible that, particularly if dietary diversity is not good, that these could compromise intakes of some important nutrients. The Eat Well Guide provides a very good direction of travel for us in a pattern that is not only that is plant rich, but is also more familiar to us and is likely to increase our fiber intake. And following the Eat Well Guide more closely would lead to likely health benefits and also environmental benefits. But as only 30% of us are meeting at least 5 out of 9 recommendations, there's room for improvement. Ways we can try to shift our diets more in this direction is to find ways to get more fruit, vegetables, pulses, sustainably sourced fish, and other plant-based protein sources in our diet, whilst limiting less healthy foods high in fat, salt, and sugar, and also reducing the amount of food and drinks that we waste. And so I'd just like to thank you very much for listening, and hopefully that provides an overview of what we mean by a healthier and more sustainable diet, but also some of the complexities that we need to consider, and hopefully, most of all, some actions that we can still take at the moment to try to move our diets in the right direction. You can find out more on this topic on our website, nutrition.org.uk. And also, if you're interested, you can register for our annual day conference on the 23rd of November, which will have more talks on this subject and is titled Healthier People on a Healthier Planet, the Perfect Outcome of a Transformed Food System. And lastly, at the bottom, you can also see the link to the full copy of the review on this subject if you're interested. And so I'd just like to say thank you again to the team for inviting me to speak to you today. And I look very much to any questions that we have in the panel discussion. Yeah. Thank you.